Please, just make it fast. The human froze, then did the unthinkable. The morning sky had barely begun to brighten when the first alien ship appeared. It tore through the quiet sky like a black streak, a jagged silhouette against the growing dawn. The people of Harland, a small farming settlement on the outskirts of Earth's colony territories, stood frozen, staring up in disbelief. For years, they had heard rumors, whispers of otherworldly creatures coming to Earth, but nothing had prepared them for this. The ship was massive, dwarfing anything humans had ever built. It hovered silently over the center of the settlement, casting an ominous shadow over the fields. Its surface shimmered, changing colors like a mirage, making it seem like it wasn't entirely real. At first, there was no sound, no signs of activity. People didn't know whether to run, to hide, or to just wait. Then the first transmission came through. The sound was strange, low-pitched, almost like a hum that vibrated deep in their bones. It wasn't a language that any human could understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a command. For a moment, everything fell silent. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. "We are the Elrith. Surrender to us or face immediate annihilation," the voice crackled through the loudspeakers. It wasn't English, but the translation was automatic, clear, sharp, and unmistakable. Fear began to settle over the crowd. The Elrith were real. The invaders had arrived. Most people screamed, scrambling in every direction. The fear was overwhelming. Some ran for shelter, others froze in place, too terrified to move. Children clung to their parents while the elders whispered prayers under their breath. Mark, however, did not run. He stood still, watching the alien ship with a strange calmness. Mark was different from the others. He was the kind of man who had always been quiet, observant, and thoughtful. His calm demeanor wasn't born out of bravery. It was born out of curiosity and the strange feeling that somehow he was meant to be here when this happened. His wife, Sarah, grabbed his arm. "Mark, we need to go, now," she urged, her voice shaking. But he didn't move. His eyes were locked on the alien ship, the hum of its transmission vibrating through him. His mind was racing, processing every piece of information he could gather from the situation. The Elrith had landed, and with them, they brought advanced technology far beyond anything humanity could imagine. The human settlement, peaceful and unaware of the wider universe, now found itself face to face with an enemy that could destroy them in seconds. "Mark," Sarah whispered urgently, "they'll kill us all." He turned to her, his gaze soft but firm. "We don't know that yet," he said quietly. "We have to wait, don't move." Sarah looked at him, confused and terrified. "Wait for what?" "I'm not sure yet, just trust me." The alien ship's engines hummed again, this time louder, more insistent. Mark could feel the heat radiating off the ship as it powered up. Something was happening. The people around them were still panicking, but Mark couldn't tear his eyes away from the massive craft. It was clear now that the ship was not going to wait any longer. Then, without warning, the voice came again, but this time it was directed at Mark. "Human, step forward, show yourself, prove that you understand the situation." It was impossible to ignore. The voice seemed to come from every direction at once, and Mark felt a strange pull, as though the words were meant just for him. He didn't move at first, uncertain of what was happening. But when he saw the alien ship shift its position slightly, he knew that it had noticed him standing there, unmoving among the frightened crowd. Sarah tugged at his sleeve. "Mark, what are you doing? They're watching you." Mark didn't respond. His mind was spinning, processing the alien command. It was unlike anything he'd ever faced. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, but still he didn't move. "Step forward, human," the voice repeated, this time with a harsh edge, commanding him. Mark's body remained rigid, but his thoughts were racing. The aliens had made their demands clear, and their power was absolute. They had technology that could obliterate them all in an instant. Yet, despite the terror, Mark couldn't help but wonder, was there something more to this? Was there a way to turn this around? His heart pounded, his mind still spinning, but one thing became certain. If he moved now, they would be just like everyone else, scared, obedient, and desperate. But what if he didn't move? The alien ship shifted again, and a blinding light shot out from it, sweeping across the settlement like a searchlight. People screamed, ducking and diving for cover, but Mark stayed frozen in place. The light swept over him, but he didn't flinch. He had made up his mind. "Mark," Sarah cried, her voice breaking through the tension. "What are you doing? They'll—" But Mark was already lost in the moment. The world seemed to shrink, the sound of his wife's voice distant in his ears. All that mattered now was the alien ship, the hum in the air, and the voice that commanded him. "We are the Elrith, do not resist." The voice became clearer, more insistent. "You have 10 seconds, speak or perish." Mark didn't flinch, he didn't even take a breath. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt no fear, no panic, just a deep, focused calmness. And then something changed. As the voice grew more demanding, Mark made a choice. The others around him were too afraid to move, too terrified to even think for themselves. But Mark wasn't like them. He was different. And maybe, just maybe, his difference could make all the difference. The alien leader had no idea what it was dealing with. Mark's eyes narrowed as he stared at the massive, hovering ship. His fingers twitched slightly, as though he was preparing for something. It wasn't the kind of preparation one makes for a fight. It was the kind of preparation you make when you've already figured out the plan, and now it's time to execute it. His stillness was a defiance, a refusal to bow down, but it was more than that. It was a calculated risk, a strategy he had already begun to set in motion. The aliens thought they had power over him, but what they didn't know was that they had underestimated humanity. Mark was about to prove that the human mind was the most dangerous weapon in the universe. "Human," the voice called again, this time a growl of frustration. "Speak now or face extinction." But Mark stayed still, his eyes locked onto the ship. In the silence that followed, he whispered, just loud enough for no one but himself to hear, "Not today." The aliens had no idea what was coming, but Mark did. And that was all that mattered. The air was thick with tension, every breath felt heavy and strained. The alien ship loomed above the settlement, its presence a cold reminder of the power that it wielded. Despite the mass panic below, one person remained still, Mark. His posture hadn't changed since the first transmission, and the silence around him had become unbearable. The people were hiding, their hearts racing in fear, but Mark stood motionless, as if he had frozen in time. Sarah, standing beside him, could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. She gripped his arm again, her voice trembling. "Mark, please, you're scaring me." "We need to run, if you don't." But Mark didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the ship, the alien craft that had stopped all of humanity in its tracks. He could sense the alien leader's gaze upon him, even though he couldn't see them. The voice had spoken directly to him, and the feeling that followed was one Mark couldn't ignore. It was as if the ship and its crew had locked onto him. They were watching him. Sarah's grip tightened as she tugged at him once more. "Mark, stop. You don't know what they can do." "They'll kill us all if you don't." Mark's hand lifted, gently placing it over hers, silencing her words. The calmness in his touch made her stop, though the terror still filled her eyes. She didn't understand. How could he stay so calm in the face of certain destruction? How could he simply stand there when the whole world was falling apart? The voice from the ship boomed again, colder this time, as though it had run out of patience. "Human, step forward. Do not resist. You have 10 seconds." The command echoed through the town, its force like a pulse that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath them. It wasn't just a command anymore, it was a threat. Mark didn't move. A few people near them, still caught in the frenzy of fear, looked over at him with confusion and disbelief. "What's wrong with him?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. "Doesn't he hear them?" But the truth was, Mark heard them loud and clear. And that was exactly why he didn't move. For some reason, Mark wasn't afraid. He could feel the alien force in the air, the oppressive weight of their advanced technology, but inside, something in him resisted the fear. It was as if he knew that the more they demanded, the more they showed their desperation. The aliens didn't understand humans, not completely. They saw weakness in their refusal to act. But Mark wasn't afraid to make them question everything. The seconds stretched on, and the countdown seemed to echo louder in the air. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The people around Mark were looking at him now, some with fear, some with anger. They wanted him to do something, anything, to give them hope, to make them feel like there was still a chance. But Mark knew that the answer wasn't in acting quickly. The answer lay in waiting. Patience was his weapon. The ship above them shifted again, and this time the ground beneath their feet vibrated, a low hum that made it feel like the very earth was trembling. The aliens were preparing something, but Mark couldn't tell what it was yet. His mind raced, calculating each possible outcome. There were only two options, surrender or defiance. The aliens had made it clear that if they didn't obey, they would be destroyed. Mark didn't know what the others would do, but he knew he couldn't give in. Not now, not when they had so much more to fight for. In the distance, the massive doors of the settlement's main barn opened slightly, and a few brave souls began to step out. They looked to Mark for guidance as though he held the answer. But Mark didn't have the answer yet. He was waiting for the right moment, and then it came. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly as he caught a small detail, one that no one else had noticed. The alien ship was no longer hovering as it had before. It was shifting its position, moving slowly but deliberately. It was coming closer, a silent predator sizing up its prey. The air around them became even more tense, and the sound of the ship's engines grew louder, resonating deep in Mark's chest. He looked up, his gaze unblinking, and then it hit him. The ship was trying to make them feel small. The closer it got, the more it would push them into submission. It wasn't just a show of power, it was a psychological maneuver, an attempt to break their will. Mark understood this instinctively. The more they pushed, the more they tried to intimidate, the more he had to stand firm. He couldn't let them know how much their presence unnerved him because that's exactly what they wanted. The voice returned, this time with more authority. "Human, you have 5 seconds. Your time is running out. Step forward or face extinction." Mark's body tensed as he felt the pressure building. But in that moment his mind cleared. The solution had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of his thoughts. He wasn't going to give in. He wasn't going to back down, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Without breaking his gaze from the ship, Mark slowly raised his hand. His fingers were steady and his movements deliberate. He wasn't raising it in surrender. He wasn't begging for mercy. It was a signal. He was showing the aliens something they hadn't expected. He wasn't afraid of them. He was calculating. He was thinking, waiting for the perfect moment. The ship seemed to respond to his gesture, shifting ever so slightly, its engines pulsing in a strange rhythm. The voice came again, but this time there was an edge to it. "Why do you resist, human? You will fall like all the others." Mark's lips barely moved, but he spoke quietly, just enough for Sarah to hear. "They think they know us. They think they can control us. But they don't understand that we're not like anything they've ever encountered." Sarah's grip tightened again, but this time it was different. Her fear was still there, but now a flicker of something else began to form in her eyes: hope. It was the first time she had seen Mark truly focused, truly determined. And for a moment she realized that he wasn't just waiting, he was doing something. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. The ship above them, its dark shadow growing ever larger, had no idea what it was about to face. The countdown in Mark's mind had begun. He was no longer waiting for something to happen. He was about to make it happen. The air hung thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the alien ship as it hovered above them, its engines thrumming steadily. Mark's eyes were fixed on the craft, calculating. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but his mind was sharp and clear, racing through possibilities at lightning speed. The humans around him were still frozen in terror, their eyes wide with fear, unsure whether to flee or surrender. But Mark was different. He wasn't frozen by fear, he was frozen by purpose. The countdown continued in his mind. The seconds were ticking away, and he knew that soon the aliens would either make their move or lose patience. Mark had been standing motionless for so long that it almost felt like the world was holding its breath. But now he was ready. He had been waiting for this exact moment. The alien leader, whatever it was testing them, testing him, and Mark knew that this was his chance to prove that humans were not the helpless, weak creatures the Elrith thought they were. He felt a strange calmness wash over him as he stood there. While others might have been panicking, he had been observing the ship, its movements, its patterns. There was a rhythm to it, something that suggested the aliens weren't as invincible as they seemed. They might have superior technology, but they didn't understand the human mind. They didn't understand how quickly a human could adapt, how fiercely a human could resist. His hand twitched slightly, the only sign of movement in an otherwise still body. He was preparing for something, not to run, not to beg for mercy. He was preparing to act, to take control of the situation. He wasn't sure exactly what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't give in to fear. Not now. The alien ship shifted again, its massive form blocking out the sky above them. A burst of light shot from the ship's underside, sweeping across the ground in a wide arc. The light passed over Mark, its warmth almost unbearable, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He knew the aliens were trying to intimidate him. They were trying to break him, but Mark wasn't about to let that happen. "Human," the voice crackled, booming from the ship. You have no choice. Surrender now or face the consequences. The tone was sharp, filled with an edge that spoke of frustration. The aliens had been trying to force a response out of him, but Mark refused to give them what they wanted. They didn't realize that their pressure was only making him more determined. The ground beneath Mark's feet trembled slightly as the alien ship powered up its engines. The sound was deafening now, like the roar of an ancient beast. The people around him covered their ears, their faces contorted in terror. But Mark remained still, his focus unbroken. The ship above him was trying to show its dominance, but all it was doing was pushing Mark toward the decision he had been waiting for. The aliens wanted him to speak, to act, to beg for mercy. But what if he did? What if he didn't give them anything? You have 5 seconds, human, the voice continued, the words now tinged with anger. 5 seconds before we wipe this world clean. Mark's eyes narrowed. He could hear the desperation in the alien's voice. They were losing control. They had expected to dominate, to crush the humans without effort. But they hadn't counted on Mark standing his ground. He slowly raised his hand, his fingers curling into a fist. It wasn't a gesture of submission. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a statement, a challenge. He was going to make them understand that he wasn't afraid of them. Sarah, still clutching his arm, looked up at him, her face a mix of confusion and hope. "Mark, what are you doing?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. She could feel the tension building, the air growing heavier. But Mark didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His mind was focused on something else entirely. The alien ship above them emitted a loud, high-pitched hum, and then a blinding light shot down from it. The beam seemed to slow, stretching out as if it were taking its time, as though the aliens were savoring the moment. But Mark didn't move. The light bathed him in warmth, but he stood firm, his eyes locked on the ship, never breaking his focus. The crowd around him was in chaos now, some people screaming, some trying to hide, some staring at Mark in disbelief. But Mark was different. He wasn't like them. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't begging. He was studying. He was calculating. The beam of light finally passed, and in that instant Mark made his move. With a swift motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, an old comms unit, one he had been keeping hidden. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The aliens hadn't noticed him carrying it, hadn't detected the signal he had been sending. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. Mark pressed a button, sending out a pulse. It wasn't strong enough to disable the alien ship systems, but it was enough to interfere with their communications. The alien ship wobbled slightly, its engines sputtering for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in their armor. A hint that they weren't as untouchable as they thought. The voice from the ship cut through the air again, this time with a hint of panic. "What have you done, human?" Mark didn't answer. He couldn't afford to give them any more information. His pulse quickened as he watched the alien ship system stabilize again, the hum returning to its steady rhythm. They were recovering quickly. He needed more time, but this was it. He had broken the pattern. He had caused them to hesitate. And that hesitation would be their downfall. Sarah looked at him in awe, still not understanding fully what he had done, but sensing the shift. "What now?" she asked softly. Mark's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Now we wait." For the first time since the ship had arrived, Mark felt the pressure on him begin to lift. The aliens, who had expected to dominate without resistance, now found themselves facing a human who wouldn't submit. The shift was subtle, but it was there. The aliens were no longer certain. They were no longer in control. The next move was up to Mark. He had set things in motion, and now he had to trust that the humans would follow his lead. They couldn't afford to panic now. They had to stand firm, just like Mark had. The minutes passed slowly, but for Mark, time had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't about fear or survival anymore. It was about proving that humans weren't weak. They weren't just prey to be hunted and destroyed. They were a force to be reckoned with. And as the alien ship continued to hover above them, Mark's thoughts began to clear. He had done what no one else had dared to do. He had shown the aliens that humans were capable of much more than they realized. Now it was time for the rest of humanity to prove it. The quiet that followed felt almost unbearable. The alien ship, hovering silently above them, still loomed like a dark, oppressive force in the sky. But something had changed. The steady hum of the ship's engines, which had once filled the air with an unsettling power, now seemed to waver just slightly. Mark had made his move, and while it hadn't been enough to completely cripple the alien vessel, It had caused enough of a disruption to make them question their control. And that, in itself, was a victory. Mark stood tall, his eyes never leaving the ship, his mind working in overdrive. He knew that what he had done, sending out the interference signal, was only a small step. But it was a step that could lead to something much larger. The aliens were no longer certain of themselves. Their confidence had been shaken, just enough to give him a fighting chance. The people around him, still shaken by the sudden turn of events, were now watching him more intently than ever. Fear still clung to their faces, but there was something else too: hope. Mark had done something they hadn't thought possible. He had shown them that they weren't helpless, that they could fight back. Even if the aliens were much more advanced, they weren't invincible. Mark felt Sarah's hand on his arm, and he turned to her for a brief moment. She was looking at him with wide eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. The fear that had consumed her before was still there, but it was mixed with something else. A quiet admiration. Mark didn't smile. There was no time for that. They weren't out of danger yet. The alien ship shifted again, its engines roaring to life, and Mark felt the vibrations underfoot. The pressure was building once more. The aliens weren't going to let this stand. He had interrupted their plan, and now they were ready to retaliate. Mark's mind raced. He had caused a disruption, but it wasn't enough to stop them. He needed more. He needed to do something that would make them question their entire mission. He needed to turn the tables completely. But how? Then it came to him. The aliens had underestimated the human mind. They had underestimated their resilience. But there was something else they hadn't accounted for. Humans were adaptable. They could learn. They could find ways to overcome impossible odds. And Mark realized that if he could tap into their technology, if he could somehow gain access to their systems, he might be able to turn the alien ship against them. He looked down at his hand, still holding the small comms device he had used earlier. It wasn't much, just a simple, handheld unit, but it had already allowed him to interfere with the alien ship's communication systems. What if he could use it to do more? What if he could hack into their technology and disrupt their systems entirely? It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. Mark glanced at Sarah again. She could see the determination in his eyes. "Mark, what are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with urgency. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the alien ship. The ships had powerful weapons, technology far beyond anything humanity had ever seen. But their reliance on technology might just be their weakness. If Mark could find a way to exploit that, if he could access the ship's systems and cause a glitch, then maybe, just maybe, the humans could gain an advantage. The ship above them made a strange noise, a sound Mark hadn't heard before. It wasn't the usual hum of the engines or the low vibrations that had filled the air. This was something different, something more complex. The aliens were adjusting their tactics. They were trying to adapt to the interference Mark had caused. Mark's heart pounded as he realized that they were reacting to him. The aliens were now aware of him, aware that he had figured something out. They were watching, waiting for him to make the next move, but Mark wasn't going to be pushed into making a mistake. He had to think carefully. He had to stay one step ahead. Sarah's grip on his arm tightened. "Mark, what if they're going to destroy us now? What if they—" "Trust me," Mark interrupted quietly, his voice steady. "We're not dead yet, but we need to act fast." He turned away from Sarah, his focus returning to the ship. The aliens were still watching him, their movements slow, deliberate. But there was a flaw. Mark could sense it now. Their systems were fast, but they were too rigid. They relied on patterns, routines. And humans could break those patterns. Mark was about to break theirs. With quick movements, he pulled the comms device from his pocket once again. This time, he adjusted the frequency, tuning it into the alien ship's primary communication channel. His fingers flew over the small buttons, and he felt a jolt of excitement when the device beeped softly in response. It was working. Mark took a deep breath, feeling a rush of adrenaline surge through him. He was tapping into the ship's systems, sending out signals, manipulating the ship's internal communication lines. It wasn't easy. The alien technology was far more advanced than anything Mark had ever seen, but the key to their power was in their reliance on it. They had built a system that depended on flawless execution, and flaws, every system had them. The ship above them shuddered slightly, the hum of its engines faltering for just a moment. Mark's eyes darted to the sky. He could see the faintest flicker of something, a glitch in the ship's systems. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The alien vessel's communication network was breaking down. Mark's heart raced faster now. He was doing it. The aliens were no longer in control. They had no idea what was happening, but Mark was pulling the strings now. The ship seemed to pause as though it had stopped in mid-motion. The humming noise grew louder, then quieter before vanishing completely. There was a moment of dead silence, and then the alien ship jerked to one side. It wasn't a complete crash, but it was enough to send a ripple of shock through the alien forces. Mark could see the ship wobbling in the air, struggling to regain its balance. The power that had once seemed so overwhelming, so final, was now faltering. Mark didn't hesitate. He adjusted the frequency again, sending another burst of interference into the ship's systems. The ship's engines sputtered, their humming turning to a strange, erratic rhythm. The air vibrated with the sound of failing technology. Mark could feel it. The aliens were losing their grip on the situation. The power was shifting. "What have you done?" the voice from the ship roared, now tinged with fear. "This is not possible." Mark's lips curled into a slight smile. The aliens hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected a human to be able to break through their systems. They had underestimated him, and they had underestimated humanity. But now they would see. The ship above them began to sway uncontrollably, its engines sputtering and flashing in an array of bright lights. It wasn't going to fall, but it was clearly struggling. And in that moment, Mark realized he had achieved something no one else could have. He had cracked the code. The aliens were no longer in control, and that was just the beginning. The air was thick with the hum of the alien ship's engines as it struggled above the settlement, its massive form wobbling and flickering in the sky. Mark had done it. He had managed to turn their technology against them. The once perfect systems that the Elrith had relied on were now unstable, glitching, faltering under the weight of the interference Mark had introduced. It wasn't much, but it was enough to throw them off course. The ship's wobble became more pronounced, and Mark could feel the energy shift in the air. The balance had tipped. The Elrith, who had once seemed all-powerful, were now facing the reality of their vulnerability. Mark had cracked their systems wide open, and they had no idea how to respond. The people around Mark, still huddled in fear, began to look up in awe. The terror that had gripped them just moments ago was now replaced by disbelief. They had been waiting for the inevitable, the swift destruction that the aliens had promised. But now the tables had turned. They were no longer the helpless victims. They were witnesses to something incredible. "Mark, what are you doing?" Sarah's voice trembled with a mix of awe and concern. She had seen Mark's focus, his determination, but now it was all becoming real. He had done something that no one else had dared to. He had struck back. Mark didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained locked on the ship above him, the glowing lights flickering erratically. The aliens were trying to regain control, but it was clear that something was wrong. They were no longer in charge, and that was exactly what Mark needed. The voice from the ship crackled again, this time with a sense of urgency and anger. "Human, you will pay for this." Mark didn't flinch. The Elrith's words meant nothing now. They had lost their confidence, their authority. They had underestimated humanity. And Mark knew that this was just the beginning. He had started something that couldn't be undone. The ground beneath them shook again, a final, desperate attempt by the aliens to reassert control. But it was too late. The ship's engines sputtered and flickered, unable to maintain the steady hum that had once filled the air. The vessel was failing. Mark took a deep breath, his hand still clutching the comms device. He had one final move to make. He wasn't sure how the aliens would react, but he knew that this was his last chance to put everything in motion. He adjusted the frequency once again, sending a final burst of interference into the ship's systems. This time, the effect was immediate. The alien ship let out a low, mechanical whine, the sound of its systems completely failing. The lights that had been pulsing brightly above them flickered out entirely. "No!" the alien voice shouted, panic in its tone. "This is not possible. You are not strong enough to defeat us." But Mark knew better. The aliens' confidence had been their greatest weakness. They had relied too heavily on their technology, too confident in their superiority, and now that reliance had backfired. Mark had proven that human ingenuity and determination were stronger than any advanced weapon or technology. The ship above them began to tilt to one side, its engines sputtering violently. Mark could see the panic now, the confusion in the alien's voice. They hadn't prepared for this. They had underestimated the human will to survive. Mark's heart raced as he watched the ship struggle in the sky, but he wasn't done yet. This wasn't enough. The Elrith were dangerous, and if they regained control, the settlement would still be in danger. He had to finish this once and for all. "Human," the voice cried out again, this time pleading. "You do not know what you are doing. We will destroy you all." Mark's hand moved again, his fingers moving over the comms device with practiced precision. The interference signal had worked. Now it was time to finish what he had started. He activated the final sequence. The ship above them let out a strange noise, a loud metallic groan, and then it seemed to freeze midair. For a moment it hung there, motionless, as if the very essence of its power had been drained away. Then, with a final, deafening roar, the ship began to fall. Mark could hardly believe it. The alien vessel, once so powerful, now plummeting toward the ground in a slow, chaotic descent. The ground beneath them trembled as the ship fell toward the earth, its massive form crashing with a thunderous impact. It was over. The alien invasion, which had seemed so inevitable, was ending right before their eyes. The sound of the crash echoed through the settlement, and for a moment there was silence. The dust and debris settled around them, the once imposing alien ship now a twisted wreck. The threat had been neutralized, and the humans had won. Mark stood in the midst of the chaos, his body still, his mind racing. He had done it. They had done it. They had faced the greatest threat humanity had ever known, and they had overcome it. It wasn't just Mark's actions that had made the difference. It was the resilience of every human who had refused to give up, who had refused to bow to fear. Slowly, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had watched it all happen, the aliens' arrival, the fear, the panic, and now she was witnessing the impossible. Mark, the quiet man who had always seemed so ordinary, had done the unthinkable. He had saved them all. "Mark," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. How did you know?" Mark turned to her, his face calm, his eyes filled with the same quiet determination. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I just knew we had to fight. We had to show them we weren't afraid." The people around them were beginning to emerge from their hiding places, cautiously at first, but then with increasing confidence as they saw the alien ship lying defeated before them. The humans had won. They had shown the universe that they weren't just some weak, fragile species. They were capable of much more than anyone had imagined. As the first light of dawn broke through the horizon, Mark looked up at the sky. The alien fleet had been defeated. The humans had fought back. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The aliens may have underestimated them, but now they knew the truth. Humanity was not a species to be ignored. Humanity had a future that they would fight to protect. Mark turned to Sarah and the others who had gathered around. They had survived, and together they would rebuild. They would rise stronger than ever before. The battle was over, but the war for humanity's place in the universe had just begun.